Hey Gen Z, come to the front of the class. You're not serious. No, you're not. No, you're not. No, you're not. Have you seen the numbers for voter registration? They are pathetic, depending on where you're sitting. If you're the person who's been agitating for change, they're pathetic. If you're the person who's been concerned about Gen Z and change, they are beautiful. Because they say one thing, no one should take you seriously. Let me go back to a kicker done by Linus Kaikai in late September. He said, Gen Z, this is your moment. He said, go and register to be a voter. Because that voter's card means three things. Number one, it's the most powerful weapon in peaceful times. It is the most consequential possession you will ever have in a democracy. But it's also the great equalizer. And Linus said this. He said, on election day, so long as you have a voter's card and you are in line, an 18-year-old and an 89-year-old, same. A rich man and a poor man, same. A peasant and a president, same. And don't tell me you didn't hear the kicker because you don't watch TV, you're online. That particular kicker is on TikTok, and it didn't get as much support as it needed because, and I'll say this again, humko serious. Let me qualify this again. Something Linus said, and I'm going to echo him. In June 2024, without billboards, TVCs, press ads, or radio ads, you mobilized each other and came out in numbers that even James Orengo, they who are the kings of Mandamano, had never seen. They were like, watcha. Are you telling me you are not in a position to say, on this day, on a certain day, across the country, we will register as voters? Are you telling me you can't do it? You mobilize, not just in June 2024, but in June 2025. I mean, how am I supposed to think that you're serious? There's the ranting, there's the clear agitating, but it comes to nothing if you can't exercise your vote. I hear you. Every time you see something, you see a bill, you comment on it, you see something happening in all our national parks, you're like, there's a problem here. But what you doing about it? I'm going to end this video by stating two things. The first one is what I said when I started. Hamko serious. Na kuna watu who are dancing every night because they now realize you're all panganga too. But I'm also going to tell you the story of three elections. Linus talked about 2002. I'll talk about 2002, 2007, and 2013. Because that was our first election after we promulgated the Constitution in 2010. Lakini right now, let me say this. Hamko serious. Hamko. And whether you can comment away. Hamko. Check the registration turnout and tell me you're serious. You're not. You're not. Come for me. I'm here. Unlike most people, I don't run for re-election every 5 years. I'm Caroline Mutoko for life. And I would not be true to who I am, ask about me, if I didn't have this conversation with you. The story of three elections, 2002. 2002 was my first re-election. You must remember, I've done how many elections? 4, 5? 1997, because I was working at Capitol. 2002, I've done both referendums. Yes, I have. I've done 2007, 2013, and I also did 2017. 2002 was a very important election, and Linus talked about it. Please look for his kicker. For me, I just started working for Radio Africa. And that year, I met both Uhuru Kenyatta and Mwai Kibaki. And those of you who know me personally know that I've always said at the time, in 2002, I had the only studio at Radio Africa. And there was this big glass window, soundproof. And I remember Mwai Kibaki came to have his pre-recorded interview, his presidential interview with our CEO then. And he walked in, just himself and Alfie Gitonga. And he was gone in 45 minutes. And I'll never forget, as he walked out of the third floor of Lion Place, we knew he was president. Anybody who works at Radio Africa and worked then will tell you we knew. 2 days later, Uhuru Kenyatta dropped in. Uhuru Kenyatta was in for longer than Mwai Kibaki. He came with Kathleen Kehanya, a couple of bodyguards, But he was very interesting, very clear, but also very young in that game. And I'm still registered as a voter at Westlands Primary because Westlands Primary is literally a stone's throw away from Lion Place. And what we used to do, and we did it in 2002, is that because we had all our cards, so we had our press card, and we'd go, literally, we would do the news. Carol Dole would read the news, would literally run to Westlands Primary, would go to the front of the line, vote. It used to take us 3 minutes, and then would be back on air in exactly 3 songs, and then tell you to go and vote, because obviously we can't tell you to do something we haven't done. That's how we used to think. That changed, but I'll explain why. And then remember, voting just goes on. So if we're running the desk, if we're running the news desk, our job is to just talk about voter turnout, what's going on, have voter papers arrived, those sort of things. So we tend to go home early. The TV stations work late, but we go home early as radio. In 2002, we went home, I think at about 4, because we knew we had to be back at the station by 4 a.m. So election returns, we don't start programming at 6 a.m., we start early. And let me tell you, because the people who start doing returns as BBC, in 2002, Kanu fell. What? Sunkuli, I don't know who. It was a bloodbath for Kanu. However, on the morning after the elections, at about 9 in the morning, 9:30, a certain Kanu candidate emerged a winner where everybody else had fallen. Who was that? His name was William Ruto, Eldoret North. Caradol tried to call to get a comment because he was the only person who seemed to have survived the night from Kanu. He didn't have a comment. But that election, and if you listen to Linus's Kaikai's kicker, he said when he met people in line, they said, Leo nimefuta mtu. Now, it's very important to understand, it wasn't about Moi. That was the one election where we were like, Tuja jama, Tuja, doesn't matter. It's when we grew because since then, members of parliament look at us cross-eyed. But we came into being, we flexed our muscle as voters in 2002, and there was no looking back. No looking back. And the reason I'm telling you the abridged version of the 2002 election, it was also the election where Uhuru Kenyatta conceded defeat. And I'll never forget, because that day, the day that William Ruto emerged as one of the few members of parliament to win a seat in Kanu, Uhuru Kenyatta conceded later that afternoon. I'll never forget, because he did his press conference at the Serena alone. He wasn't flanked by a lot of people from Kanu, but he was with Bill, as we called him, excuse me. And I will leave it for the other political pundits to tell that story. But the reason I'm telling you as Gen Z is that I'm sure you're probably saying, if I'm 25 now, In 2002, Caroline, I was a zygote. But it is up to me, to Linus, to others to tell you, because we were bold enough and there were people around us who just had the chutzpah, and I know it's a Yiddish word, to say, let's do this. We did this. I'll go back to my first video. Hamko serious? Hamko. We didn't just vote in a man who took his mantle of presidency seated because he had hurt his leg. No, Google Mwai Kibaki taking oath of office. There was no pomp. Jama had a cast. But we're very clear. Kainde. We rewrote the trajectory of this nation by electing Mwai Kibaki. And there are people who tell you we didn't vote for him, we voted against Daniel Arap Moi. Doesn't matter. We did it. How are you going to write the history of our nation in 2027? Because at the rate you're going, 2-term is possible. Musiniambia temeyo. You have not mobilized each other to vote. So what are you doing? No, munadu. 2007 election. That's my next video. Ata si change nguo. So it's so important for me to say this. In 2007, Kenya was on the cusp of greatness. Literally. If this is the edge, we were hanging over the edge. We were going to. And it was, to be honest, voting day was like any other. By then, I'd done the 2002 elections. We'd done the referendum, the one that produced chungwa na bananas. And then there was the 2007 election. There was one or two surprises. I remember it was the election where the leader of the official opposition, who was Uhuru Kenyatta, joined the incumbent, Mwai Kibaki, and now they were one team. And I was like, so Raila Odinga was solo. But he was with a gentleman called William Ruto. And once again, the reason I remember this election very well is because the lines were big, but not so big that it was like, that election was called 2013. But I remember I didn't vote at 6 a.m. And it's because I remember as we came to work, and I have a feeling Carol Dole and Nyambane can attest to this, the line from Westland's primary, by the time we were getting to the office, election day we start early, at 5 a.m., the line was at Sarit Center. You know, think about it. Westland's primary, Sarit. 2013 was another story. It was at Westgate. And I remember my security detail told me, "Ay, madam, apa ata na bunduki siwezi kupitisha. Fanya hivi, wenda job." I told him not to worry. And that day, I voted at about 4:30. It's also a very good time to vote. 4:30 in the afternoon. Kila mtu ashaenda. I walk in, napiganga story, tunamaliza. There's no rush. There's no crowd. So election day was fine. The next day was a bit because someone Kivuitu was doing this thing of, I do not know where my returning officers are. I do not. And remember, we come to work to do election results. Here, the next day was also a bit weird now. Because at some point she said, no more, things were closed. And I remember Paulie Lado was at KICC. Hey, you can feel it in the pit of your stomach, but you don't know what it is. Because remember, we've never had strange elections as Kenyans. Anyway, I will never forget, it was a Friday. So the way it was agreed was, Carol Dole and Roy and Kenny used to do something called Saturday Sport. So I would run the news desk and then there would be, so I'd be doing what she always used to do. She used to feed the studio. I'd be in her side, but feeding the studio. I used to live in Westlands then. So I had gone for my usual morning walk at Joffrey's and I'd left my phone in the car. I mean, come on, this was 2007. I get back to my car and the phone, I mean, I have missed calls for So obviously you go through them and you return the important ones. And it was Carol Doole's call that, of course, I reported because I knew I'll go home, shower. I lived in Westlands. I lived on Raptor Road, so getting to the office was nothing. And she was like, Chick, I think we're going into the office early. I was like, why? She says, iko shida. Then I returned Emmanuel Juma's phone call, and he said, have you heard anything? I was like, Kwani, what have you heard? He said, nikunoma. This is probably about 10 in the morning. It's not late. And the other person whose call I returned was Washira Ororo. Said, hey, Muskeja. So we assemble, literally like the Avengers, straight to the office. I went home, I showered, straight to the office. Adol came in, Ramanyang came in. Nyambane was not at work that Saturday. But you know that one of, we don't know what we're walking into. I think at about 2 p.m., Emmanuel Juma, you will correct me. It's Emmanuel who called me and told me, Chick, we tell our story or we allow international press to tell our story. Because between Reuters and BBC, they had already seen all the clashes that had started in Kibera, in Mathare, in Bondo, in Kisumu as well. So either we were going to wait and then international media would tell our story, or we were going to tell our story. There are parts of 2007 I still can't talk about. And I think I've said this in different forums. Frank Njenga has tried, but kuna katrauma hapo, sijamalizana nako. So we knew when NTV was going live with the footage they had, so we went live. So that Saturday, there was no sport to our Saturday. Things that I used to see in other countries. And being constantly not sure about what happens when you raise the mic. Because it's one thing to know what you know, and this is the thing I think is very important, is that you must remember for every photographer who prints a picture in a newspaper, for every cameraman who puts together footage for TV, for every reporter who writes copy, for every radio presenter who raises the mic to be able to say something, they know the thing before you do. Now, the thing about 2007 is knowing it and not having the language for it. We left the station that day probably at about 6:30. By that time, Mishuke had declared there would be no live broadcasts. Rumors about nonsense and things that were real and not real were rife. But the truth is, Kenyans were killing each other. We drove home to empty streets, knowing we need to come back to the office the next day, but not knowing whether we'd be raided. All of us. Whether you worked at KTN, Citizen, didn't matter where you worked. Because where there is no information, the only thing that circulates is disinformation. I'm not going to go into the swearing in at dusk. Major General Ali, the stuff we did, we burned. And I tell Gen Z this, you register and you vote so there can be no doubt about the outcome of the election. No doubt. What Tanzania is going through is what we went through in 2007. 2007 and 2008 was hard. And not just from the election angle. If you guys thought COVID was crazy, let me give you something that you can relate to. Nothing prepared you for 2007. And in my lifetime, I never want us to go back there. And that's why you register to vote. You get serious about the things you're saying. Because you need to ensure that that election is clear. It's not 50+1. The margin has to be decisive. Because anything less, register.